Okay, we'll go ahead and get started. We have this space for about an hour. Thank you all for joining us today. My name is Jessica Shao. I'm the Narrative Strategy Manager at the Climate Justice Alliance. I'll be moderating this conversation. The Climate Justice Alliance is a growing member alliance of 88 urban and rural frontline communities, organizations, and supporting networks in the climate justice movement in the so-called US. Member organizations lead CJA by anchoring major just transition projects focused on the social, racial, economic, and environmental justice issues of climate change. We are locally, tribally, and regionally based racial and economic justice organizations of Indigenous peoples, Black, Latinx, Asian, Pacific Islander, and poor white communities who share legacies of racial and economic oppression and social justice organizing. We're hosting this conversation to elevate people's solutions to the climate crisis. Throughout COP28, we have seen that our perspectives are consistently sidelined. Our leaders are gaslighting us with the massive PR machine that upholds the fossil fuel industry. They're trying to sell us these so-called solutions, these dangerous distractions, scams, whatever you want to call them. They do not work, that allow the US to continue this fossil fuel expansion and their imperialism. There's 2,500 fossil fuel lobbyists here. A leaked OPEC letter has shown that the industry is lobbying hard against any phase-out language of fossil fuels. Civil society expression is restricted and very limited. Calls for demilitarization seem to go unheeded, even as the US's military-industrial complex causes climate destruction. So today we've gathered experts from frontline communities across the US to report on what they have witnessed at COP28 and what we're bringing back into our movement spaces. Our panelists are Jackie Patterson, the Executive Director at Chisholm Legacy Project, Panganga Pungawi, the Climate and Geoengineering Organizer at the Indigenous Environmental Network, and Julia Bernal, the Executive Director at Pueblo Action Alliance. These incredible leaders have been showing up every day of these 2 weeks and beyond to ensure that frontline communities' perspectives are present in this imbalanced space. I will let them introduce themselves and share more about their work later on. We were going to start this conversation with some updates on negotiations from Tamara Gilbertson, but she's probably still in those negotiation spaces, so we will just continue along directly into the conversation. As you may have noticed on your seat, you'll see these hoodwinked in the hothouse booklets that share some of the false solutions and also provide some data and resources and information on why these solutions are these distractions are so dangerous for our communities. If you want some facts in your arsenal, so please take a copy with you and take a copy for your friend and share it far and wide. I'd like to ask our first panelist, Julia, what is a false solution and how do they impact frontline communities? What are some ways that people can identify them?
Yeah, thanks Jessica, and thanks everybody for being here with us today on the very last day of COP. I know it's been an incredibly exhausting few weeks, but I want to just appreciate all of the dedication that many frontline organizers and organizations have been contributing to the conversation in terms of false solutions. So for us, I think that we really try to ensure and educate our communities that false solutions is, essentially a narrative that comes from the grassroots, and that it came out of climate justice principles. So there's the climate justice, or the Bali principles of climate justice that came from many grassroots organizations that participated at the COP to essentially define how corporations, transnational corporations with the partnerships of nation states are perpetuating these climate solutions that are essentially nested in global markets and global capitalism. And there are many investments, energy investments that are going towards techno fixes, geoengineering, which is what Pananga is going to be talking about more today, and energy investments for energy production sources that have either been proven not to work, aren't well researched, or just continue the fossil fuel industry. So we feel that we cannot solve the climate crisis within the same market, the same sort of system that caused the climate crisis in the first place, and that also finds loopholes to continue extractivism and global transnational capitalism, and then also mechanisms that are based in the market and also continue like that legacy of impacting frontline and indigenous communities. And so that's sort of like I guess the loose descriptive definition of what false solutions are. But one thing that we all like to continue educating on is that it is like a language war as well. And so all of these different types of false solutions that, you know, are in the hoodwinked, are in our literature materials that we have currently, they're eventually going to change and evolve to ensure that communities, civil society, anybody isn't able to really identify a false solution. So that's why like panels like these, popular grassroots education opportunities are really those really important spaces in order to learn like how insidious and, you know, tricky and evil these types of mechanisms are. So I'll end there.
Thank you, Julia. And so with that, what are some of these dangerous false solutions and scams that you have been seeing at COP28 and the impact of what has been proposed on your particular communities? I'll pass it to you first, Julia, but I'd like everybody to answer this.
Yeah, sure. And then just one other point that I forgot to make on the last question is that especially those of us that come from indigenous communities or indigenous-led organizations, a false solution is also something that is continuing the commodification of what is sacred and this financialization of nature, so like materializing our cultural and natural resources. But so particularly where I'm from in the state of New Mexico, we have this legacy of fossil fuel extraction. So there's two very productive oil and gas basins in the state, the Permian and the San Juan Basin. And all of those highly productive areas have fracking, natural gas pipelines, produced water, you know, just all of like the waste that comes with any type of fracking operation. So there's been like a very urgent and robust conversation around like what does the just transition look like? How is it going to be equitable or fair to frontline and indigenous communities that have felt like the historic brunt of extractivism? And so in New Mexico, our governor, Michelle Lujan Grisham, actually was the only governor in the United States to come to the COP and talk about how she is wanting to endorse a just transition by using hydrogen energy. And so our organization views hydrogen production of any sort, of any color, as a false solution, ultimately because it is continuing fossil fuel extraction. And so an example in New Mexico is that our governor has been really pushing green hydrogen. And, you know, there are environmental organizations and communities that do believe green hydrogen is a real solution because it couples hydrogen production with solar and wind energy, but it also uses an immense amount of water. And so our organization, since like 2019, have been following this issue and have been arguing against green hydrogen because we're in a semi-arid to arid environment, and as like climate change is impacting our region, that aridification is continuing. And so the concerns that we have around water security was like basically our main arguing point on not to endorse green hydrogen. But after the governor was here and was meeting again with different transnational partners, she had announced after her trip back from Dubai that she was going to invest $5 million in a green hydrogen plant that would use produced fracking water as its water source for hydrogen production. And so to us, we're like, okay, that's, I guess, her way of addressing the issues around water scarcity. But the water that is used for fracking is ultimately coming from a fresh source. And then when it's going through its fracking cycle, then that is the fracking waste that is going to also be used to produce green hydrogen. So essentially it is continuing fossil fuel extraction, business as usual. And on top of that, we've been fighting against green hydrogen for many years already. Communities and stakeholders and our organizations have protested any type of state legislature that would use state funding to match any type of federal funding for hydrogen build-outs. We've written letters to Department of Interior to discourage the state of New Mexico's application for IRA and BIL funding. So we've been like, you know, continuously showing up as communities of color, as indigenous people, as youth to say, no, hydrogen is a false solution. And yet our governor, who is supposed to represent, you know, us as her constituency, is continuing, you know, with this like green hydrogen dream, because it will essentially appease all of the fossil fuel industries in New Mexico. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Julia. I think that paints a really clear picture of how language around these false solutions is actually supporting expansion and continued extraction. I'd like to turn it to Pangaga now and ask, what are some of the similarities between these sorts of false solutions and the extraction that you've been seeing in your community?
Wanga aka bangangang ng naka bangawi, wanga adaka akanatuma naka Kirsten Nuva Pas, wanga Thiwunga kami. And my Rumka or my clan is a Piwagami. So I'm going to share about the history of my island, how extraction and militarism have caused genocide in our communities, and how those are kind of parallel to both the fossil fuel industry as well as the false solutions that are being proposed here. So my island is St. Lawrence Island. It's between Alaska and Russia. The first wave of genocide caused by extractivism was with the European whalers. They came in the late 1800s to get whales for the baleen and the oil. They wanted the oil for perfume. They wanted the baleen for like corsets and writing crops. So they came and they decimated our whale population, which caused a great famine because it collapsed the marine ecosystem. And at the same time, Krakatoa erupted and caused a plume so great that Alaska experienced 2 years of winter. And so we had a great famine that wiped out 99% of our island. And then we repopulated our island with relatives from Siberia. People came over, they speak the same language, they have the same culture. And so we have very close direct ties with relatives in Russia. And when I was born, I was gifted with a blanket and some china and some other gifts from our relatives over there. When we're born, we're named after ancestors who have passed on, and we take the kinship roles of those ancestors. And so I am known as a grandmother already, both in Siberia and here in Alaska. So during the Cold War, those relationships were not strained, but it was very difficult to maintain contact with our relatives over there. And the military built a base on our island that was large enough to sustain 200 troops for 2 years. And when it was time for them to leave, they didn't want the base usable by anyone, so they were told to take a backpack, cut the lines, and leave. So they spilled all of their fuel that was available for 2 years, the heavy metal solvents, and it seeped into the tundra, and it leaked into a lagoon where our children learned how to swim. People got drinking water, and it's where we got fish. And so it is said that if you lived at Northeast Cape at the time that this happened. It's not a question of if you get cancer, it's when. We also live in the Bering Strait. There are only two thoroughways to the Arctic, the Bering Strait and the Fram Strait. And I don't know if you know this, but pollutants travel north through the currents. And so those are the two thoroughways that pollutants use to travel north. So we are living in a cancer cluster already due to extractivism. We have suffered 99% population loss. And even when we've repopulated ourselves, the military disrupted our relationships. And then we were also used as experiments in Alaska. We were given shots of radioactive iodine to see if our bodies would survive longer in the cold. During the 1964 earthquake, men volunteered to go clean up, and we've been shared a history where women were sterilized when the men were gone. And so we have been used because we know that the purpose of colonization is always resource extraction, and if you are the people who populate the area where the resources are, then the first step is genocide. And after that is assimilation, indoctrination, and so you see a lot of that. And the way that we were indoctrinated was for the purpose, of course, of resource extraction. There was one sole person who was in charge of assigning religious denominations to our region. There are 13 regions in Alaska, and each one of them was assigned a church by one person. And if you lay the map of where the resources are in Alaska and you lay a map of those denominations, they're the same. So in the north, there was one denomination, and that's oil. And in the west, there was another denomination, and that's gold. So anywhere where there are resources, there was a church that was in charge of indoctrinating people, assimilating people for the purpose of resource extraction. And those regions are what formed the native for-profit corporations that were created on behalf of us in lieu of reservations in Alaska. So they kind of learned better, in a bad way, from the reservations in the lower 48. That's what we refer to the rest of the United States. And they changed how they colonized us in Alaska based on how the lessons that they had learned there. So we have a long history of being used as the stepping stool and the dumping ground of the military, of capitalism, of extractivism. And we are seeing the continuation of that through false solutions and the dangerous distractions that are being pushed here. So in order to over-emit to the point of where we are in crisis now, you have to have people and places designated as sacrifice zones. You have to sacrifice where you're extracting. You have to sacrifice where you are refining. If people were treated equitably and were given equal rights, there wouldn't be any over-emitting permitted. We wouldn't be where we are now. And in that same thread, you cannot have false solutions without the sacrifice of people, the continued sacrifice through extractivism, but also all of the experiments, the very majority of them are done on Indigenous lands for climate geoengineering without our free, prior, and informed consent. And so if you want to see what a false solution is, put your sacrifice glasses on and see, is somebody being sacrificed? Is this still based in capitalism, patriarchy, white supremacy? And then you'll know it's a false solution, that it's something that's, because what is the question that we're trying to resolve, right? Is it how do we stop the climate from changing? Or is it do we change the relationships that we have with each other and with Mother Earth? Do we change how we're doing business? It's not a question of us trying to change the symptoms of what is happening so much as it is going back to the root, because the root is what's caused the issues, and if we don't change that, then we're not going to change anything.
Thank you, Ponyanga. Yes, mic drop right there. And it's so true that so many of these conversations that are happening at COP are at such a superficial level that even discussions of transition to a green economy are fueled by just green colonial economic interests. COP is a space where the global north and the wealthier powers that be have learned these lessons to insidiously structure itself in order to uphold this status quo of resource extraction and sacrificing our communities. With all that said, Jackie, what are examples of dangerous distractions you've seen in your work with communities throughout the US and the dangerous distractions that US officials have been pushing in this COP space?
Thank you so much. Yeah, so you can hear me? Okay. So yes, I was born on the south side of Chicago, and it's only now doing this work years later that I realized what I was born into. When I was growing up, it was about, waiting for the ice cream truck to come. It was about hopscotch and playing games in the front of the house. It was about just the innocent joy of childhood. And now looking back, I know that my home was in the midst of a major highway called the Dan Ryan Expressway, where trucks and cars were going through, exposing us all to near roadway air pollution. I know that we were sandwiched between 3 coal-fired power plants, which we later learned from our own report, Cold-Blooded Putting Profits Before People, was where some of the most toxic coal-fired power plants in the nation that were putting out sulfur dioxide, nitrogen oxide, mercury, arsenic, lead, and really poisoning our communities. I now know that I was living near one of the biggest landfills in the metropolitan Chicago area. And I now think back in retrospect about the kids who had asthma in our communities. And we know that African American children are 3 to 5 times more likely to enter the hospital from an asthma attack and 2 to 3 times more likely to die of an asthma attack than white American children. So all of those statistics started to make sense when I thought about all the kids who had asthma in my school. And I thought about the young boy who passed away from asthma attack in my school. I think about the people in my church who were often kind of rolling those respirator machines, and then it was just life. I didn't know that it was any different than anyone else's life, because that was my community, and that's all I knew. And so, as I also look at statistics around infant mortality and around maternal mortality, some of the things that I started to see make sense, and we know that African American woman is 4 times more likely to die in childbirth. And we also know that the toxins that come from these facilities are directly tied to endocrine disruptors and other challenges that interfere with with our public health. And so as I think about the alternatives, the false solutions, one solution that's often used is, why don't you just move? That's what's often said to our communities. In East Chicago, Indiana, when the lead poisoned the soil to such an extent that the soil was contaminated at 30 times the allowable rate. And the allowable rate shouldn't even be allowed at all. And so that's the other thing, is that the standards are already so insufficient. And when you have such an extreme violation of insufficient standards, you're being directly poisoned. And so after remediating the soil time and time again in East Chicago, Indiana, they finally decided, oh, well, it's not going to be possible to remediate the soil. These folks are just going to have to move. And so for the most part, the people in that community were in public housing. And so there were really no slots for them in Indiana. So they actually had to move to entirely different states because there wasn't enough public housing in the state that they live in. So the place that they lived for generations and generations, they were the ones who had to move because of the pollution from corporations. And the corporations weren't paying The corporations weren't offering any compensation, and they weren't made to pay any compensation. It was a community who paid the price on multiple levels. And these are the types of stories that we know that really embody false solutions. When we think about solutions like unnatural gas, we know that we always hear about the fracking stories from the West, and also in the western United States, but also even in the eastern United States, in North Carolina and Appalachia. We also have instances of fracking, and people. I worked with communities there who talked about the health impacts that they feared because they knew the health impacts that others in the West were facing. We also know in places like Oklahoma, they used to have 35 earthquakes per year above 3.5 on the Richter scale. Now they're averaging 300 earthquakes per year above 3.5 on the Richter scale. And it's directly tied to fracking, and yet even though the geologists unanimously declared that this was the tie, they still refused to institute a fracking ban. So again, profits before people. We also know that the impacts of landfill gas in our communities, that landfills tend to be disproportionately located in lower income communities and communities of color, BIPOC communities. And so whether it's the BP oil drilling disaster, where again another fossil fuel disaster, but the results of it were that the toxins that were saturated with Corexit, which is banned in 90 countries throughout the world, but not the United States, of course, because again, profits over people means that the toxic release inventory and the list of things that we consider to be toxic is much smaller because of the lobby of the American Chemical Society. And instead of valuing the lives and the public health of people, we allow toxins like Corexit to be used in massive amounts to clean up the BP oil drilling disaster. And where did those kind of toxin-soaked burns and so forth go? They went into landfills that are disproportionately sited in Black communities. And those landfills are underregulated themselves. So we have places like Jackson, Tennessee, where where a landfill eroded, the liner eroded, and that toxins ended up going into the water supply, poisoning a homestead of Black families to the extent that they started to have rare cancers, rare forms of birth challenges, and so forth. And it was only then that they found out that years before, the white families had been sent a letter to say that the water supply had been contaminated, and they hadn't been sent those letters at all. And they also found out that the animal shelter that was next to the landfill had been given an alternate supply of water for the animal shelter, and yet those communities were left to drink that water for years. And so I bring this up in the context of false solutions because landfill gas is considered to be one of the solutions we can use, the methane that comes from landfills. I could really go on and on and on. I'm not sure where my 5 minutes are, but I would also cite nuclear being, even in one of these, especially in one of these sessions, they were talking about nuclear being an alternative. And I happened to be sitting just kind of on my laptop and saw this woman talking to some folks she was just indoctrinating them on nuclear being the way that we need to go. And I almost wanted to interrupt, but I did not. But I was with Climate Justice Alliance, and I think it was actually one of the members of the IEN that was hosting us in Cayenta, Arizona. I was struck when I was going through the community. We were having a Our Power retreat. I was struck when I was going through the community that they had a clinic for uranium mine workers. The fact that you actually have a clinic that's dedicated to uranium mine workers means that something's wrong. I mean, it's actually institutionalized that uranium mine workers are going to be so sick that you need to have an entire health facility that is dedicated to their care. That is just the ultimate in injustice. And I'll end there with the fact that there is a community in Grand Gulf, Mississippi, where they built the Grand Gulf. It's Port Gibson, Mississippi, and they built the Grand Gulf nuclear station. And when they brought it in, people were afraid of what health impacts it would cause. And sure enough, there was a spike in infant mortality in that community. And one person was talking about, she was 29, she was 29 years old when she was talking. And she said she had lost 5 members of her class from breast cancer. She was 29 years old. And over the years, she had lost 5 members of her class to breast cancer. This is a tiny community, so I don't know what the size of her class size was, but it couldn't have been that big. And so again, this just shows us the types of exposures that we have. And finally, ending with carbon markets. We know that as Black communities, we were the first commodities to be traded in the markets and with the slave trade. And so the markets never work for us, and they certainly aren't working now when they're trading away our lives and our well-being. So those would be the fall solutions that I would lift up. Thank you.
Thank you, Jackie. And I'm about to pass it right back to you. It's just funny, and by funny I mean hypocritical and awful, that Carrie has been talking about so consistently, oh, we're just following what's in line with the science, but clearly from every single example that all y'all have shared, there is only listening to the private interests and not the actual science of what's actually affecting our communities. And so why is it important for us to be in these global spaces and have international solidarity?
I'll be super brief because I think I lost oxygen here. But I think so. One is even calling out the falsehoods. One of the times we were here, one of the lead negotiator for the United States talked about carbon capture and sequestration, and he talked proudly about carbon capture and sequestration in one of the large plants that was being built. And he said, "Oh, this is really the top technology. This is going to save us in terms of capturing the carbon that harms our atmosphere." And he's like, and it's certainly not harming people. It's built way out in the middle of nowhere. And one of our delegations stood up and was like, "Hello, my name is Kathy Eglin. I'm from the middle of nowhere," because Kemper County, Mississippi is somewhere to the people that live there. And so she was really able to call it out and challenge what was being said there, because they can come here and say anything, if we're not here to hold people accountable to what they're saying. And I know we're all have a story to tell around that. And so that was that I would say would be a prime example of why it's so important for us to be here. And then another example is to wrap arms around each other in solidarity, because we do have common cause, whether it's Bridgetown, Barbados, or Bridgeport, Connecticut. We have common cause on being on the front lines of these challenges. And so really coming together and finding that common ground, finding that common voice, and really building power for those common demands is why we're here, and why we really started the Global Afro-Descendant Climate Justice Collaborative, because we want to have the structures, the common policy platform that we're advancing from the halls of the UN to the halls of Congress and Parliament, down to the city councils and the MPs in our various communities and in our various nations. So I'll, again, keep it simple and short.
Thank you. And Panganga and Julia, I'm sure you have lots to add here, so I'm passing it right to y'all as we continue to make this connection between frontline communities across Turtle Island and the UN negotiations. And I know that, Western science versus traditional indigenous knowledge has been something that y'all have been fighting for in the text as well. So I'll just pass it on to you for some connections.
Yeah, I think I'm going to talk a little bit about the technologies that are being pushed here in terms of just climate geoengineering. But before that, in concept, I want to make it very clear that the list of disadvantages or the list of harms that come from geoengineering technology is not the critique that we're necessarily pushing. Like, it's important for us to know the technologies and to know the issues with them, but the bottom line is that these are not in alignment with our traditional indigenous knowledge systems. We've been in relationship with the ecosystems where they're trying to deploy these technologies for millennia. We've been in relationship with them. They're not, we're part of those ecosystems. We're not separate from them. So if people are trying to create a solution to help an ecosystem that we have been in relationship with, we need to be a part of that conversation like decades ago. We don't. So oftentimes when we do push for free, prior, informed consent, but I want to make very clear that that's the floor. Like, that's not the ceiling. It still implies that things are done to us from the outside, and people inform us of those things that are being done to us from the outside. What really needs to happen is a shift to the power in the communities who are directly in relationship with the ecosystems in question. So a lot of the technologies are related, of course, directly to the fossil fuel industry. A lot of these technologies are being funded and pushed by the fossil fuel industry, by billionaires, as a tactic to greenwash and offset the things that are being done by the extraction industry. So there's two main categories of climate geoengineering. One of them is called solar radiation, either management or mitigation or manipulation. So they say SRM, but that M can kind of change around, but it's all around solar radiation. And that's supposed to control how much sun is reaches the surface of the earth or is kept in this part of the earth. And the other category that's usually talked about is CDR, or carbon dioxide removal. And then there are other variants. So marine geoengineering is another term that kind of combines those two, but is focused more or less on the oceans. So we've had experience with all forms of geoengineering being tested on our lands. For solar radiation, there was a large project called ScopeX, run out of Harvard University, funded by Bill Gates. And this is a stratospheric aerosol injection type technology where they're trying to spray millions of tons of sulfur dioxide into the stratosphere, which would mimic a volcanic plume. And if you remember the history of my island, that is not going to impact all areas of the earth the same. So it might lower the temperature, and there's a whole host of problems that the scientists who are pushing for it themselves have identified. But that lower temperature is going to be uneven. It's going to impact people inequitably. And so when Krakatoa erupted, 2 straight winters in Alaska. Yeah. So this would require treaties and agreements between nations all across the globe in order to deploy it, because they themselves have shown in their computer simulations that this will cause drought in the Amazon rainforest. It will disrupt monsoon cycles. It comes down as acid rain after 2 years, and you have to deploy it consistently every 2 years or every year, depending on who you're talking to. Because once you start, you can't stop because of the termination impact. So if you start and then you stop, then the earth will heat up more than it would have had you not done it to begin with. So a whole host of problems, and this is something that's being discussed here. It's being discussed at the White House. It's being discussed at UNEA. It's being discussed at the Arctic Assembly. A lot of international bodies are discussing this technology. And NOAA has converted old bombers to measure aerosols in the sky. So when they start experimenting, they can see where those aerosols are going. So already our governments are funding this technology and getting ready to use it. Another form that was tested in Alaska is silica hollow glass microspheres. It's a solar radiation management, what they call surface albedo modification. So they're changing the reflectivity of the surface to reflect sunlight back into space. So this woman was spreading football fields worth of silica onto our ice in Alaska without the free, prior, and informed consent of indigenous peoples. Already we have a high level of silica in our gravel, which leads to high rates of tuberculosis. We have high rates of rheumatoid arthritis. We have high rates of kidney disease. There are a whole host of problems that come with an imbalanced level of silica. And this person who developed it used to work for Chevron for a couple of decades, was working for 3M at the time they developed this technology, and all of the materials are sourced from 3M. So, I mean, there's also ocean fertilization, where they want to dump iron ore or another substance into the ocean by millions of tons, billions of tons. It depends on how often and for how long they would do it. The last time they did this experiment in 2012, the rate of toxic algal blooms increased in our homelands the subsequent year. And now, when you're talking about carbon markets as well, they're talking about using whales as offsets. Whales are sacred relatives. They've sustained us. We've been in relationship with them for millennia. They're our relatives, and they're wanting to use their bodies as offsets when they die, because whales sequester carbon when they die. They're also talking about using caribou and reindeer, as well as bison, and they're already using salmon as biodiversity offsets as well. These are our relatives, and we have had a sacred relationship with them, and it just, every time I think about it, it makes me feel really, really sick. There's another technology that was tested off the coast of Nome. This company, Real Ice, they want to put water pumps on the top of ice in the Arctic. In order to be effective, they'd have to cover 10% of the Arctic with these pumps. They're supposed to be fueled by green hydrogen. And on their website, they talk about how the indigenous people are going to be running the technology. And the indigenous people, they're like, oh, and we're so good, we're going to let them have the carbon credits for it. But they haven't talked to the indigenous community. They only met with the white mayor and like the Chamber of Commerce and other folks in our community there. So they're just, if you go onto the geoengineering map online, that a number of organizations, ETC Group, Home, other folks have contributed to, you can see that there are thousands of technologies. Over 50% have been, they track them like back into the 70s. Over 50% of them are from the last 5 years. And so like the number of tests and experiments, and those are just the ones that we've come across, and not all of them are up there. And they're also talking about, the narrative shifts, of course. So they were talking to the Human Rights Council about these technologies, and instead of saying geoengineering, they were trying to call them new technologies for climate protection in their special report. And they were, there were some questionable practices in terms of including indigenous voices in those conversations. In the end, I think we felt more or less heard, but it's still concerning that that shift in the narrative, when you're talking about technologies that are created to prolong the fossil fuel era, because these are going to be used as offsets. They're used to greenwash people who are polluting us. And then on top of that, insult to injury, they're testing it on indigenous lands who are already being sacrificed. So it's kind of like a double. I don't know if I answered your question.
That does, yeah, certainly. Thank you. And to make room for some of the real solutions, I think I'm just going to get into that part now, since it's clear that, billionaires are messing with a lot of things that they don't really know that much about, living beings, and the earth is not their playground, when the real solutions are so clearly rooted in people, in communities. So to all panelists, and I'll start with Julia and then move to Jackie and then Hanganga. what are some examples of the real solutions, what they look like in your communities and the communities that you work with, and how are folks who are watching here support the real solutions in your communities? This will be the final question, and then we'll perhaps close out.
Yeah, me and Panongo were talking about this in the car because it's a big question, and ultimately, there needs to be like this long-term work and long-term vision of dismantling global capitalism and any sort of type of agenda that is rooted in colonialism and neoliberalism. But there for like, at least for me, and just like hearing from our panelists here too, I think one thing that I just want to add is that we as Indigenous people are providing a very important analysis, not perspective, an analysis that's rooted in science, that's rooted in traditional and generational and historic knowledge that are providing solutions that can be appropriate for land-based or local community-based thinking, because as we're talking here, the false solutions that are being touted at this conference ultimately come in like this one-size-fits-all sort of packaging, because they do believe like one specific type of technology is essentially a solution for the various different geographies and climates across the world, and that's just not the case, because that just isn't realistic. And as like climate is changing, as temperatures are rising, as coastal lines are also rising as well, there is going to be a very necessary there's going to be necessary action coming from those communities, because they're experiencing climate change at rates higher than others, while contributing to the least amount. But on that note too, I just wanted to like also add, especially in like my region, we are a resource rich region, but we've also been one of the areas where militarism has also impacted our communities. And if we're not addressing militarism on a global scale, then we're also doing a disservice to climate justice, because all of what we hold sacred, all of these relatives, what non-human relatives that live in our region, that sacred earth is being disrupted and used to manufacture weapons that are going towards war in places like Palestine and Sudan, that we ultimately need to like have a larger voice on, here on this in this conference, because the resources are coming from Indigenous lands in our region are being used for war. And so again, if we are looking towards Indigenous ecological knowledge, we can attempt to start shifting paradigms on how we view the natural world, and and ultimately become like that better relative. And then in terms of and this is like kind of like meta question, but just wanted to also expand on what Jackie was talking about on solidarity. Having this internationalist analysis is going to be critical for also addressing climate crisis, because again, what may be happening like in your region could also be affecting another region on the entire on the other side of the world. And so this conference is a good place to like meet those people, to talk to people about what their communities are facing, and finding those links is going to be also an incredibly important component when we're creating real solutions.
Okay. Yes. So again, in terms of real solutions, I want to point out, as my co-panelist said, that these solutions are already with us. That whether it's Indigenous leadership or other folks who are close to living close to the land, that the knowledge of how we can be in harmony with the planet, how we can be in harmony with the regenerative nature of our planet and our ecosystem, and still actually there's an abundance, unlike the kind of scarcity narrative that we're constantly having to counter. It's not an either or, and it's really the scarcity analysis that has resulted in this extractive economy. People feel coming and colonizing places, feeling like or determining that that their level of greed and avarice was such that they had to displace and murder, when really all could live. There's enough for all to live in harmony. And so when we think about leaning into those traditions, I think even in my childhood, my dad was Jamaican, and my mom was from the Black Belt of Mississippi, and in our backyard in South Side of Chicago, we grew tomatoes, cucumbers, mint that we used every day for mint tea and mint lemonade in the rare slices of summer that Chicago enjoys. So we really leaned into our relationship with the land, and those lessons really came back when COVID came, and I ended up growing a whole garden on my balcony. I made an entire bruschetta with tomatoes and so forth, just from what I was able to harvest on my balcony of my little condo. And so these are the ways that we can actually not just survive crises, but that we can actually live as people. So whether it's the local food movement led by groups like Soul Fire Farm in upstate New York, which is really leading on how we can do this in terms of our own food, whether it's local energy projects, a group like Highland Park in Michigan, where they had their electricity for their streetlights turned off by DTE, the local utility, again, profits over people. And not only did they turn off the streetlights, but they came and they took the street poles away because they decided they were never going to be able to pay their bills for the municipality. And the community came together, and they had lemonade sales and did whatever they had to do in order to get the revenue that they needed to get solar streetlights for their community. And so now they're living off the grid independently with those lights. In Arizona, where I was hotter than I've ever been in my life. I've been on the equator multiple times, and I haven't been as hot as I was when I was in Phoenix, Arizona. And one of our colleagues had her electricity turned off repeatedly by the utility. Again, these utilities that are making millions of dollars, or turning off kind of the lifeline for people over a couple of $60 bills. So she finally decided she wasn't going to give another dime to the utility. She just kind of saved up her money every month, and then she got on her own roof. She was an electrician, and installed her own solar panels. And then we worked with her, and she wrote an article, Utility greed locked me out of the grid, but God-given sun set me free. And so she is now living off grid through her own design. And so we have local energy projects all over, from the Black Mesa Water Coalition and others throughout the nation. Community controlled water, groups like We the People of Detroit are making sure that they're holding their utility accountable for providing safe and affordable water for all. Groups like For the Love of Water are actually owning their own utilities and demonstrating those types of models. And groups like the Bus Riders Union in Los Angeles are pointing out that we need to value transit over single car transportation, and really are pushing for a carless Los Angeles, which is one of the most congested cities in the nation in terms of riding. And then there's communities that have actually demonstrated that universal basic income, providing a basic income to everyone, actually doesn't result, unlike the kind of, again, scarcity mentality and this kind of stigmatizing of people that says that if you start to give people universal income, basic income, then they'll be on the dole or dependent in a way that, just dependent on government aid, when actually the truth is that when you give people enough to get by, to rise up, then they're inspired to be able to get jobs. They have a restoration of dignity, of hope, of possibilities, by just giving people enough to have a livable life, and then people come off of universal basic income if necessary. I mean, when they have what they need. And so these are the kind of models that we need to be thinking about. These are the kind of models that are already happening and where communities are thriving. When I was in the midst of a disaster, they called it snowpocalypse, and so it was like a citywide blackout in Pennsylvania, and I was in a hotel and I had to stay over because all the flights and trains were canceled. And there was a Haitian sister who worked at the hotel, and she said that she, on her entire neighborhood, her home was the only home that had electricity because she had solar panels on her house. And so that it was, she sent me a picture, and it just showed this one house with lights in the midst of all of this darkness. And I tried to follow up with her to be able to tell more of her story, but she kind of ghosted, and I think it was because of immigration status issues there. And it then made me think about how people are coming to the U.S., how people are not welcomed in the U.S., even though the U.S. is 4% of the population, but yet 25% of the emissions are drive climate change. And yet we have these punitive immigration policies instead of welcoming people with open arms. But we see that whether it's indigenous communities, black communities that hold on to traditions, and immigrant communities, these communities are our salvation. They know how to live in a way that helps us to not only adapt to climate change, but actually curb the progression of climate change. And so she, by being literally a beacon of light in her community on so many levels, is someone who actually has to be in hiding, even though the way she lives should be something that's actually highlighted for us all to see. So I will end on that note, and also with the words of Warshan Shure, who is a Kenyan-born Somali poet who talked about the immigration experience and what our views need to be on the immigration experience. And the quote is that no one puts their child in a boat unless the water is safer than the land. So I end with that to say that we really do need to have safe havens. We really do need to have open borders. We really do need to be a part of a global community instead of an oppressor within the global community as the United States. So thank you.
It's okay if I over it.
We have time. There's no one in this space for another hour, so it's okay if we go over by a few minutes.
Okay. I had a few words I wanted to read. Let's see. So I always recall my colleague Acacia Kamasuk, and she had some words of wisdom when we were doing a panel in Southern California. She starts out by saying, as a society, we have forgotten how to be in relationship with one another. And indeed, colonization, patriarchy, white supremacy, militarism, capitalism, and an extraction-based economy have stolen this from us. All of these unnatural ways of being work together to sustain each other. Climate solutions are not preventing sea ice loss or reflecting sunlight. We do not address climate change by treating our land and waters as carbon sinks or building man-made structures to sequester carbon. These show that Western science narrowly focuses on the symptoms of climate change, leading to a cycle of running to the next emergency, attempting mitigation, not meeting the threshold, and then starting over. Focusing on mitigation and not the root cause, like the burning of fossil fuels, is a deadly compromise we cannot afford. True and sustainable solutions do not lie in a university or a laboratory, but in relationship with your community, local organizations, and the indigenous peoples on whose land you reside. Indigenous peoples have been in good relationship with the land for time immemorial and have managed to protect 85% of what's left of Earth's biodiversity. And then I also wanted to, I had some notes written down. So, when we look at climate policy, we must revisit the values which founded the creation and structure of the proposed policies. If we continue operating as though one value system and one way of being is the only standard in which to live, we will continually struggle with our ability to thrive together on a livable and thriving Mother Earth. Keep it in the ground and let Mother Earth heal. She has shown us her power and ability to adjust herself. During COVID, when emissions were reduced, the ozone repaired itself. Tribal sovereignty heals the climate. Indigenous rights heals the climate. Land back heals the climate. Climate change is a symptom of injustice. Climate change is not possible without the exploitation of specific populations of people. If we were all treated equitably, fairly, and justly, the colonialism, patriarchy, and white supremacy as long as those are in power, are able to divide and conquer humanity.
Julia, any last words?
Do you feel complete?
Wonderful. Thank you so much to our panelists, these powerful leaders, for sharing their expertise today. We'll close the formal discussion here. Please take these stories, the science, the knowledge that they've brought back to your own communities, and please pick up a hot house on your way out as well.